Hello, and welcome to ISDA's webinar on initial margin documentation. This is our first webinar on this topic, and we're going to be covering an overview of new initial margin documentation that ISDA has published in 2018 and 2019. My name is Mark New. I'm Senior Counsel for the Americas at ISDA, and I'm joined by Doug Donahue, who's a partner at Linklaters. So the initial margin regulatory requirements phase in over time. They're going to be applying to a broader and broader scope of firms based on the size of their uncleared derivatives portfolios. And as they come into scope of the initial margin requirements, they will need to enter into new initial margin documents. The first phase was in 2016, and ISDA published phase 1 versions of the initial margin documents, which were based on the New York Law 1994 Credit Support Annex and the 1995 English Law Credit Support Deed. And they were intended for use by the largest derivatives dealer firms who were coming into scope of initial margin in 2016. But actually what we saw in practice was that those documents continued to be used by entities in phases 2 and 3, so 2017 and 2018. But as we approach phase 4 in 2019 and phase 5 in 2020, more buy-side firms are expected to come into scope of the initial margin requirements, which is really changing the types of firms that will have to enter into these documents. So in 2018, ISDA worked on a number of new versions. We sometimes refer to those as the next generation versions of the initial margin documents, really focused on that broader range of entities coming into scope in phases 4 and 5. And those were published at the end of 2018, and additional docs have been published in 2019. And in this series of webinars, we're going to be providing an introduction to the key features of these new documents, really focusing on those new provisions that were put into the next generation documents.
How these Reg IM documents fit into the ISDA architecture is complex. And that complexity is driven in large part by the regulatory requirements of IM, which have necessitated some really fundamental changes to the way we expect and know ISDA documentation to work. In my experience, it's really key to get your head around these fundamental changes in order to be able to build kind of a knowledge base around the Reg IM documentation. So with that in mind, and really looking to build a strong foundation for everyone, the first place we want to start is with terminology. So some of the terminology that you'll hear when dealing with the Reg IM documentation is, you might not be surprised, Reg IM. And really what people are referring to there is initial margin that is required by the relevant regulations. You'll also hear the term negotiated IA. Negotiated IA refers to initial margin or independent amount, that's where the IA comes from, that is negotiated by the parties, meaning there is no regulatory requirement for the parties to exchange it, but they've negotiated for credit or other reasons that it must be exchanged. Then we have VM, and VM refers to both negotiated variation margin and any variation margin that's required by the regulations. In addition to that, you'll hear people refer to different types of trades. And in many cases, what they're really referring to is when those trades were entered into, and you'll hear the term legacy trades, and that will apply in the context of Reg IM to trades that were entered into prior to the Reg IM compliance date. And when you hear the term in-scope trades, that will apply to transactions that are entered into after the the relevant Reg IM compliance date, and therefore in scope of the Reg IM requirements as between the two parties.
So before we get into the documents that have been published to deal with those new trades that Doug just described, here is just a little bit of background on the evolution to how we got here, because this really helps people to put in context the new documents and understand where the provisions came from. So as I mentioned a few moments ago, the phase 1 documents were based on the form of 1994 New York Law CSA and 1995 English Law CSD. And these were both documents based on a security interest approach, but they by themselves didn't contemplate posting to a third-party custodian in a segregated account, which, as we'll see, is of critical importance for Reg IM terms. Then in 2011, ISDA published Seg IA amendments that could allow those earlier documents to be used with a segregated account at a third-party custodian. And that was intended for voluntary segregation that the parties wanted to do, principally for credit reasons, to ensure that a party posting collateral wouldn't lose that collateral if the party receiving it were to enter into insolvency proceedings. Then we flip forward to 2016 and the publication of the first documents for regulatory initial margin, the Phase 1 documents. And these, of course, comply with the regulations, and so they require the parties to post into a segregated account and make a number of other changes to the earlier documents to allow for reg compliance. And we'll be going into those in later webinars. And then in 2018, those Phase 1 documents were updated for the next generation versions to reflect the broader scope of entities coming into scope in Phases 4 and 5 of the initial margin requirements. In 2019, we added some additional documents, what we call the collateral transfer agreement and security agreement approach. And this was introduced to address a potential conflicts of law issues where the parties are using custodians in a different jurisdiction from the governing law of their contractual agreements. And again, we'll be going into this in more detail in a later webinar. Now, this is only really a flavor of the documents that have been published to date. And on the next slide, we show in more detail the specific documents that are available. And you'll see under Phase 1, there are documents under New York law, Japanese law, and English law. There are also specific documents that ISDA co-published with Clearstream and Euroclear for those specific offerings. The next generation documents from 2018 and 2019 were very much based on those earlier forms. So again, we have a form of New York law CSA, English law CSD, we have Clearstream and Euroclear agreements, and then we have what we call the bank custodian collateral transfer agreement and security agreement that I mentioned just a moment ago. But this isn't the full story. There are, in fact, additional ISDA documents dealing with some local law issues, particularly French law and some Japanese law collateral issues, which are also available. And importantly for Reg IM, the ISDA documentation isn't the end of the story. Parties will also need to enter into documents with their custodian, and these will typically be either tri-party agreements, meaning both parties and the custodian will be party to those agreements. And in this case, there isn't a single industry form that's used, but each custodian will have their own form of agreement that the parties will negotiate with each other and with the custodian. And if the parties are using a central securities depository like Clearstream or Euroclear, then there will be membership documentation to be entered into by the parties with the particular central securities depository. So overall, the message is there are a number of new agreements that parties will need to become familiar with, and we're going to now cover some of the specific issues for the ISDA documents.
So the illustration that we have in front of us now really highlights one of the key fundamental differences that drive, one, how the Reg IM documentation is set up, and two, really the architecture around Reg IM documentation, how it fits into the overall ISDA architecture that we'll go through. So on this slide, really the key takeaways are that at all times, both Party A and Party B are posting Reg IM. Those amounts are not netted, and they are both posted to a third-party custodian, in this case, Party A custodian and Party B custodian. Now, that as you'll see, that will have a big impact on architecture and some other key decisions and choices we'll be making when you start negotiating your IM documentation. A number of other key differences that you'll see in the Reg IM documentation from the 94, 95, and some of the other historical documentation that Mark went through is the way in which the parties calculate Reg IM. So the regulatory requirements are that you calculate IM in one of two ways, either through an approved model or on the basis of the regulatory prescribed tables, or also known as grids. The other question that will come into play when you're documenting your Reg IM relationships is what transactions are in scope. We'll also have to determine or deal with the fact that there are two-way collateral flows and the impact that that will have on, again, architecture and other decisions we make. We'll need to keep in mind that IM needs to be segregated with an independent custodian at all times. So as Mark mentioned, that will mean that you're not only negotiating ISDA published documentation, but you'll also have to consider bespoke custodial documentation. And then finally, what's provided for in the 2018 documents, because as Mark also mentioned earlier, those documents were really built for a broader segment of the market coming into scope for regulatory initial margin, is those documents provide a couple of hardwired options that allow you to customize within the three options the interaction between regulatory initial margin and negotiated IA. All five of these items actually will be covered in future webinars in much more detail. So we thought the last thing that we wanted to go through during this webinar was really the illustration you have in front of you now, and it covers a few things. It'll cover both architecture and covered transactions. So first, we wanted to put this illustration up because it gives people a good sense, we think, of what sort of architecture they'll be thinking about when they come into scope for regulatory initial margin. So no longer will parties who are in scope, who have trading relationships that are in scope for regulatory initial margin, have a single CSA under their ISDA master agreement. They will, at a minimum, have two CSAs and potentially more than two. The illustration here has three CSAs. One variation margin CSA, which can also house negotiated IA, and then two one-way regulatory initial margin CSAs. And that is very common through phases 1 through 3, and we expect to be common in phases 4 and 5. The other thing to highlight on this slide is the two types of trades we have. So we have both legacy trades and in-scope trades. And as we discussed before, legacy trades are transactions that were entered into prior to the regulatory initial margin compliance date. And as a result, as you see on the illustration in front of you, the legacy trades are margined in your VM CSA, meaning they are not subject to the regulatory initial margin requirements unless the parties agree that they want them to be. The other type of trade you have here are in-scope trades, and those are trades that are entered into. And I continue to use the term entered into intentionally because that has some meaning under the regulation. It's not simply the day on which a trade is executed. The analysis can be more complicated than that. I just wanted to note that for people. But in-scope trades are trades that are entered into on or after the relevant Reg IM compliance date, as you will see, have both Reg IM collateral flows to the IM CSA and the IM CSD in our example, as well as a VM and negotiated IA collateral flow to your existing CSA, VM CSA. And I really want to put an underline under that point because that will mean that you will have a single transaction that is margined under multiple CSAs. So not only is that something that everyone on the legal side will have to get comfortable with because it's new, but it's also something that institutions will need to understand on a much broader basis because this will impact stakeholders beyond legal. In particular, this will have an impact on the operational groups and collateral management, as it will likely cause there to be multiple collateral calls, which people will need to be able to process on a daily basis.
Thanks, Doug. So that takes us to the end of this first webinar. I hope we've given you an overview of the new docs and also given you some signposts for things to look out for, and that will be covered in future webinars on these topics. If you do have any further questions regarding the material here, please do contact us at ISDALegal@isda.org. The address is showing on your screen there. And thanks very much for listening.